For years, the Chinese Communist Party has sought to expand its influence globally, economically, politically, and through intelligence operations. In recent months, a scandal has erupted in the UK with allegations that the British government deliberately suppressed evidence of Chinese espionage to protect trade ties. In this video, we'll talk through how it happened, who is responsible, and why the integrity of Britain's national security may be at risk. Espionage is not just Hollywood fiction. States routinely spy on each other, especially in sectors like technology, infrastructure, academia, and politics. For the UK, with its global reach, open economy, and close intelligence ties to allies, infiltration risks carry outsized damage. The question at the heart of this scandal is, has the UK government itself become complicit by suppressing evidence in order to preserve trade with China? So who are the key players and institutions involved in recent scandals? Jonathan Powell, National Security Advisor to Prime Minister Keir Starmer, allegedly played a central role in suppressing a Whitehall China audit and influencing prosecutions. Keir Starmer, Prime Minister, ultimately answerable for his government's national security stance and transparency. And there are Treasury officials, according to reports, lobbied to suppress release of audit findings to avoid damage to trade and investment ties with China. Then there is the Foreign Office, originator of the China audit, which assessed espionage, influence operations, and vulnerabilities. Director of Public Prosecutions, DPP, in charge of deciding whether to prosecute the alleged spies and who is accused the government of withholding evidence. Chris Cash and Christopher Berry, two individuals accused of spying for China whose prosecution collapsed. Foreign Secretary David Lammy gave statements defending engagement with China. Rachel Reeves, Chancellor, involved in high-end economic discussions with China and part of the narrative about UK-China ties. Currently, the US government is concerned that the UK handling of the case may endanger intelligence sharing and the special relationship. Opposition figures and commentators, including Kemi Badenoch, Sir Richard Dearlove, former MI6 chief, Simon Dunchuk, looked at Pulford, pushing for accountability and warning of deeper issues of collusion. So what is that China audit? It's a cross-Whitehall, basically cross-departmental analysis commission to study Britain's overall relationships with China, covering espionage, influence, operations, vulnerabilities in academia, trade, infrastructure, and governance. It emerged internally from the Foreign Office, but was intended to inform government policy toward China. So what was supposed to happen? Normally, after such a review, governments might release an executive summary, redacted excerpts, or a full public report to build public trust and allow scrutiny. The audit would have exposed how much Chinese spying or influence was ongoing in the UK, and where British institutions were vulnerable. What went wrong was the suppression. In June, Powell decided that the government would not publish the detailed audit or make full revelations. The reason was that the Treasury officials allegedly warned that releasing too much would damage trade and investment ties with Beijing. Instead, the audit was folded, largely redacted or subsumed into government's national security strategy document, which appeared in June. The strategy included only 2 short paragraphs referencing China, far less than executive summary would have offered. Other options, for example, an executive summary with major findings about Chinese espionage in the UK, were vetoed by the National Security Team and the Cabinet Office. The government's official explanation was that the details were redacted for national security reasons, for example, protecting intelligence sources and methods. The government has not denied the suppression claim in full, but also resists giving full disclosure. If those efforts were merely an internal redaction, that's one thing. But when suppression of evidence carries into prosecutions and decisions about national security itself, we move into far more dangerous territory. That brings us to the critical criminal case, Chris Cash and Christopher Berry. Chris Cash and Christopher Berry were accused of spying on behalf of China. Their trial was to take place at Woolwich Crown Court. Days before the trial, the case collapsed because the Director of Public Prosecutions claimed the government failed to provide key evidence requested over many months. The government, on instructions from national security leadership, some reports point to Powell, had decided Beijing should not be described as an enemy in the trial, a required framing under the Official Secrets Act. Also, the government didn't label China as a national security threat in that context. It's a strange position, as in fact MI5 and MI6 and various government entities had designated China as a threat during the period in question. Starmer has claimed that the prior conservative government had never declared China a national security threat at the relevant time, so those charges could not be pursued. But official records show that security agencies had designated China as a threat during that period. The contradiction raises serious doubts about what was happening behind closed doors. The White House has privately warned Starmer dropping the prosecution could damage the special relationship with the United States. The US is reportedly concerned about intelligence sharing, especially with a partner perceived as unwilling to confront CCP infiltration or coercion. As one senior US source puts it, "We exercise extreme caution in sharing information with foreign governments subject to adversarial coercion." The fact that the two alleged Chinese spies escaped prosecution has raised alarm in Washington about the UK's reliability. So collusion, suppression, appeasement. Critics argue this is not accidental, but a full-scale cover-up. That Powell and Treasury acted to suppress damaging evidence likely to avoid angering Beijing and scaring off China's investment. One minister reportedly claimed that the decision to drop the case was made to appease China. Otherwise, there would be no further investment from Beijing. There is also a suggestion that ministers outside the security cluster were blindsided, with word spreading in panic only after the decision had effectively been made. While the government tried to minimize Powell's role, they have not denied that he was involved. The fact that Powell folded the China audit into the national security strategy suggests he was central in suppressing disclosure. Treasury lobbying is a little bit murkier. We don't know exactly what methods or pressures were used, but the claim is that they urged non-publications to protect economic interests. One minister's quote, "If Powell and Rachel Reeves tell Kier to do something, he does it." Opposition leader Kami Badenoch has accused the government of deliberately collapsing the China spy case and then trying to cover it up, while weakening UK's global standing. There is also a wider alarm. Sir Richard Dearlove, former MI6 chief, has questioned Powell's suitability. If his views make him equivocal about China's risks, maybe he should not be the national security advisor. The Liberal Democrats, Tories, and some in Labour are pushing for a parliamentary debate. Questions are also being aired about whether government actions could amount to perverting the course of justice or worse, cooperation with a foreign state under the National Security Act. Luke de Pulford of the Interparliamentary Alliance on China said, "Powell had no role in evidence. Then who decided what the CPS could see?" This raises even more questions. This scandal is far more than political theatre. It calls into question whether the UK is being compromised from within, whether national security is being subordinated to trade with China. If proven, the consequences are profound. Damage to UK sovereignty, breach of trust with key allies, notably the United States, weakened domestic security institutions, and a loss of faith by the British public in their leaders' willingness to defend them. Right now, we're having the following questions unanswered. What underlying CCP influence operations in the UK may have been enabled or hidden? How were British institutions, stack, academia, infrastructure, local governments being targeted? And what precise decisions were taken at Downing Street and by Powell? And can they be reversed or held accountable? And the final one is, what must the UK now do to restore integrity, secure critical systems, and prevent further infiltration? What we've just seen isn't an isolated scandal. It's a part of a much broader, long-term strategy by Beijing. The CCP's approach mixes espionage, economic coercion, elite capture, and information control. Across Europe, and especially in Britain, Chinese entities have used partnerships, investments, and scholarships to gain leverage. The logic is simple. If Chinese money or market access becomes indispensable, then politicians, investors, and even civil servants begin to self-censor to avoid upsetting Beijing. That's why the Treasury's intervention over China audit looks like economic interest overruling national security. China's state-linked firms have invested heavily in critical infrastructure, nuclear projects like Hinkley Point, the energy grid, telecoms, and property near sensitive military sites. Dozens of British companies attend embassy-sponsored roundtables, such as the one Yuan Zhejun led in June, promising new impetus for manufacturing and finance cooperation. These are not ordinary meetings, don't forget about it. They help Beijing build dependence networks where future leverage can be applied. British universities host thousands of Chinese state-sponsored students and researchers, many in dual-use fields, AI, quantum, aerospace. Some Confucius institutes remain embedded on campuses, quietly shaping narratives about China and discouraging criticism. MI5 has repeatedly warned that data sharing agreements and joint labs may expose sensitive research. From allowing Huawei into 5G networks to depending on Chinese capital for green energy projects, successive governments have treated economic ties as untouchable. Powell's call for direct and high-level engagement even after espionage allegations fits in the same pattern. And as the result, a foreign adversary gains veto power over Britain's transparency and even in its courts. If Britain wants to remain a trusted democracy, it needs a clean break from policies of concealment and dependence. That means full publication of the China audit, redacted only for legitimate security reasons. Independent inquiry into why the cash barrier prosecution collapsed. Legislation mandating transparency of foreign state funding in politics, academia, and media. Investment screening reform to block hostile acquisitions of critical infrastructure. And public awareness, because infiltration fails when sunlight exposes it. Britain's greatest strength has always been its openness. But openness without vigilance becomes a weapon in the hands of those who wish to control us. Whether the Starmer government can repair the damage or whether this marks the start of a deeper erosion of sovereignty will depend on what happens next week in the parliament. The world is watching, and so are Britain's allies. If you found this analysis useful, like and share the video. And in the comments, tell us whether you think the UK can still be trusted as a secure ally. And remember that freedom is not free.